So my name is Ember Kelley, and I'm the Director of Religious Education here at Fourth Universalist Society in the city of New York. And we are really excited for tonight's event. It is the second in our Pop Culture and Theology series. In January, Colin Wolfe and I sat down to talk about the Legend of Zelda. And now this month, the Reverend Schuyler Vogel and I will be sitting down to talk about the theology and be a little bit nerdy about the Lord of the Rings. And we're pretty excited to get to discuss some of these deeper meanings. We've got a great bit of guiding conversation, but we're definitely going to just be kind of flowing with the direction that things head. And if you have any questions, feel free to either write them down, put them into the chat. However, we're planning that that'll probably come about, I was going to say 6:45, but 7:45, about 45 minutes in. We will start fielding questions from the chat box. So just if you have an urgent question, let us know in the chat and or save it till then. But since we are at 7:01, I'm going to hand it over to the Reverend Schuyler Vogel to do a little talking about what is the Lord of the Rings, in case maybe you are coming here just for a good conversation and know nothing about Lord of the Rings.
So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're glad you're here to talk about Lord of the Rings. I know Ember and I and Colin have been reading up on Lord of the Rings this last week, and it's certainly one of my favorite series. It was my escapist reading for the summer, where I blew through the three main books, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, and parts of The Lost Tales, as well as Children of Hurin. So there's a lot of different information out there, and a lot of great reading for Lord of the Rings. But if you, to share kind of the overview of it, this is it's a fantasy series that was written, roughly in the first half of the 20th century by a guy named J.R.R. Tolkien, who was an English professor of linguistics at Oxford, and his life is notable for a lot of reasons. He was formed as a young man, having been sent to war, the First World War, fought at the Battle of the Somme. At one point, wrote that all but one of his great friends had died, and so he is somebody who was deeply shaped by loss and by conflict. And also was someone who's deeply interested in mythology, in religion. We'll talk more about that as the night goes on. But he started creating these fantasy worlds from a very early part of his life, even back when he was a soldier in the war, where he started creating these worlds and these narratives and these languages that he would put together. And so in some ways, the books that we know that are most famous, The Hobbit, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, are in many ways the product of decades of work that already happened, and so we have them now, and we appreciate them. They were basically published from the late 30s through the 1940s, and they're often sort of erroneously attached to World War II, but in fact they're shaped. The ideas behind them were shaped much earlier than that. A lot of us know them from the modern era, from the movie trilogy that was put together by Peter Jackson and others, and that of course re-energize these stories that are of course classic and timeless in their own way for a next generation and for this time period. So that is a basic overview, and we're going to dive into a lot of things about Tolkien himself, about the messages that Lord of the Rings has to offer us, and what it has to do with theology and the way that human beings perceive and understand the world. So that is a basic 101 of what Tolkien and Lord of the Rings is about. And, there are whole books written about him and this series, but just to get us started with some of that. So, Ember, would you like to start us off with some more in-depth conversation about Tolkien?
Definitely. And I'd like to also just let folks know that this part where we are speaking is being recorded. We do have it set to only record speaker views. So if you're watching this in the future on YouTube, we also say hello to you there as well in the future. Hope it's nice there in the future. And so Tolkien, I'm much more of a Midwesterner, I suppose, in my pronunciation. You have picked up the proper pronunciation, and I still say Tolkien because it's what all of my friends said growing up. But he's just this really interesting guy. He is himself a very, very, I mean, I dare say, a hardcore Catholic. I mean, would you agree that that's a fair assessment, Schuyler?
Yeah, he was very much being big into being Catholic, and that was a huge part of his identity.
Yeah, and not just any Catholicism. This was very Orthodox, very, um, this is pre-Vatican II, so this is very, masses in Latin. This is what was really meaningful for him. He was also good friends with C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia series, was made into slightly less popular movies, and but is also pretty well known from that same era. And they were close friends, and C.S. Lewis was an atheist in original conversations with him and converted to Anglicanism. And I know that Tolkien was often a bit upset about that. Like, why hadn't he made the full jump to being Catholic? He had some very, very strong personal convictions about religion. And the interesting thing is, a lot of literature that we classified as like Christian literature often has very, very clear allegories. Like in the Chronicles of Narnia series, you have like Aslan, the lion who sacrifices himself, which is very clearly this Jesus type figure. But in the world of the Lord of the Rings, in the world of Middle Earth, you have a much broader thing. This is not like, oh, well, here's the very obvious Jesus figure. So he was really setting about to create this proper mythology that he wanted to create. Do you want to? I know you've looked into that a little bit, Reverend Schuyler. If you want to maybe touch on like his hope and dream with like creating a big myth.
Yeah, so it is really the Lord of the Rings and the whole world of Lord of the Rings, right? It's not really just about the rings. If you read the Silmarillion and all the other lore and stories, there's some Silmarillion. Lord of the Rings is just one part of it, but Tolkien came at this from an initial desire of experiencing and loving mythology from other parts of Europe. He loved looking at Norse religion and mythology, and part of him would read this and he wrote a lot about Beowulf as a myth and as a story and loved that. And he, as an English person, in some ways mourned the fact that there wasn't really much preserved from English lore and mythology pre-Christian. That in some ways, even as a Christian himself, he felt that Christianity in England had basically bulldozed these sort of archaic mythologies that other countries had and that were really powerful, that in some ways were the seeds of what he understood to be the true religions of Christianity. And so he set out, he said, we need to have some kind of lore. And so he started out with developing the lore of the Lord of the Rings world in order to essentially offer that up to his country as an English person. But it's tricky because he, like Ember said, he wasn't like C.S. Lewis, who wanted to be allegorical. He was vehement that he was not trying to like say things about the world. He wasn't trying to be like, this person represents this person and this is like, this guy represents this part of the human nature. He was really, he would get very upset at people trying to pretend like this was about something that was happening in the real world. Though, of course, I think we can all be kind of aware that like every artist, right, is inevitably influenced by their world, unconsciously or not. And he actually came to admit that. He was writing to a Jesuit priest once, and he wrote, basically, this is the quote: "The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision." So that both points out that he started it, writing it, and he as he continued to write it and revise it, he realized that part of what he created came out of an unconscious Catholicism of his own. Also interesting in that quote is that the revision part is important because the Lord of the Rings was consistently revised for quite a while after it was initially published, and so the version that we have today that you get in the story is not the same version that you would see if you got the first edition. Part of that is that his world was so complex that there was a lot of inconsistencies, actually. And once people started reading it, they'd be like, well, actually, in this other text, that's not exactly what you had to say. And so he, and then later his son, would go back and be like, well, okay, actually, this is what we meant to say. That was just like a revised draft of that got snuck in. So even they had trouble kind of keeping things straight. But I think that commitment to the Catholicism of it fit. I mean, he would also write this idea that like, and this is almost kind of you in a way, but like he said, I don't feel any obligation to make my story fit formalized Christian theology, although I did intend it to be consonant with Christian thought and belief. And so this idea of not trying to be formulaic about it, not trying to be creedal or doctrinal about it, but having the spirit of it reflect the spirit of Christianity in a way that was definitely there in some form. And we'll talk about kind of what that spirit was, right? Like what are the Christian messages that come with the stories and the characters and the morality of it. But that Christianity and that Catholicism specifically was very much embedded in the roots of the stories, as he believed was embedded in all the mythologies of the world. As a Christian, he sort of saw them as like basically proto-religions that were human beings working out their meaning making and their relationship with gods and the universe, and that Christianity was sort of like the hierarchical next evolutionary stage to those, which is problematic in a lot of ways if you kind of think about that in relationship to like, a lot of sort of indigenous traditions and other religious, even Judaism, right? That like Christianity basically was like, well, we figured it out. Thanks for that work, but like we're on to the enlightened view of what religion is. And Tolkien definitely had that view, and sort of saw mythology in that. But he also didn't dismiss it as sort of irrelevant or evil. He saw it as sort of in the roots of the tree, which is better than some people of his day.
You talked in there about the revisions, and it couldn't help but make me think of the most recent text that I've read since returning from living abroad is The Fall of Gondolin, which is one of the more recently released. I wasn't able to get it and find it very easily abroad, but once we were back, I was like, okay, it's time. This is my. Oh, I see we got a copy in the giant pile. I too have a pile for those watching. It's just I don't have a shelf or anywhere to put it near me. But one of the interesting things about it, and it kind of threw me off a little bit at first, as I tried to just sit down and enjoy it as a read, is that it's his son chronicling how it was revised, also in a sense. Like he presents like basically like 8 different versions of the same narrative that like his dad had worked on at varying points in his life, but these were all being written before he even had thought of the actual central Lord of the Rings trilogy itself. This was, a whole mythos for the world way before that. It was so drastically different. His desire for myth was just, like he didn't want just one story. He wanted to be this fully populated world that really had its own meanings, and that's to bust out if I'm going to keep referring to my books, my copy of the Silmarillion is actually one of the. I read things a little bit out of order in my Lord of the Rings experience. As a high schooler, I will admit, and don't tell my high school English teachers, I read Fellowship of the Rings for a book report, and then I watched the Two Towers movie for a book report because I struggled to get through the book. But then the interesting thing was that a friend recommended, hey, have you read the Silmarillion? And I was like, okay, like I'll give it a look. And it fascinated me in a way that the Two Towers didn't, which is strange because it is this huge lore heavy and like very broad thing, but it was so intriguing and interesting to see all of these threads that he was laying come together. I think that's one of the really like beautiful things when you've explored the wider lore that it's this this broad stream that he was so desiring to build into this huge myth. It wasn't just, okay, well, here's the story of these guys in this ring, but it was a whole universe that he was creating much sooner than the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I would say. And one of the interesting things, though, as we prepared for this discussion, is we noted that while he may have had his very strong theologies, you don't ever hear that like the characters are going to church. You don't hear them pray. It seems that there isn't any like plain and obvious religion and theology in the series. Reverend Schuyler, you got any thoughts with regards to that? Or like why was it that he doesn't explicitly say, here they are worshiping the proper Christian God or something like that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and he was asked that in an interview as well, where there is definitely an awareness based on what the different races. There are elves, there are humans, there are hobbits, there are dwarves and orcs, and each race that he has a certain spirituality, or a certain orientation or relationship to the world. The elves have a deep awareness of the land beyond the sea, and that place is a sacred place, and I'm probably the most aware of any kind of beings that exist in the form. The Lord of the Rings series has, and Silmarillion and all those. The world has its own mythology that Tolkien created. There's a creator god. There are essentially angels called the Valar. Sauron and Gandalf are essentially versions of minor angels that have been either sent or wind up in Middle Earth to do things. Right? Gandalf is sent there to basically check Sauron along with four other wizards who are essentially mini angels from the big angels who are powerful. And so those exist within the world. And so what's interesting is, right, that like you don't hear Aragorn before a big battle praying to any of those beings, even though the elves might be like they exist, and the elves have some awareness about that. But Tolkien leaves it kind of quiet. I think there's a feeling that the dwarves have a relationship with their creator god because that was a relationship that was sort of obvious to them. But it is an interesting thing that he kind of leaves it quiet around that. But it's also interesting that he creates this mythology within it that is also not totally aware to the characters themselves. I think a big part of The Lord of the Rings is this sense of separation and loss of the characters from this primordial past that in some ways was wonderful and beautiful. There's all these stories in Silmarillion and other texts that Tolkien created that go back way before the hobbits appeared and Frodo and Bilbo were bopping around Middle Earth. Huge wars, two whole continents were basically destroyed and sunk into the ocean. One of them was very much reminiscent of the fall of man story from the Bible, and so there were the archetypal stories, but a lot of this has been lost in memory to the characters that we have here, which is, I think, poignant. Part of what the human experience is, right? That like we are, you can both be in myth yourself as these characters, and also be looking back to the past, to all the myth makers before you, and feel small in comparison. There's a part in the movie and in the book where the Fellowship is sort of on this river going along, and then there are these two huge statues of the past that are kind of framing the shot, and you look at it and you just imagine how small they look in comparison, and what mighty king or empire created those things, and there they were, these small rugged people. The kings of the north had long ago fallen, hundreds of years ago. The great empires of men were falling apart. Gondor and Rohan were threatened, and so this sense of loss of those stories in the past and the myths was even real then. And so I know we're going to talk a little bit about how Tolkien's relationship with progress and history, because that's fascinating too. It's very different than, I think, Unitarian Universalist progress in history. Ember, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I wanted to dive into Silmarillion there, but I think this is also a fascinating direction that we can discuss. Is he definitely had this as someone who grew up in a very Christian worldview, evangelical Christian. He had a very similar worldview, that original sin, that everything is corrupted, everything is predisposed towards falling apart, that they're going to have these great empires like you were mentioning, but they will fall, and there will always be some big threat. Like, sure, the original big evil Melkor is defeated, but then there's Sauron, and that is defeated in the series, but then someone surely will rise again after. There's always, he has this view of history that there's a great quote about it in America Magazine, that he subscribes to a Catholic imagination, in which the greatest fight is not external, but against temptation. And the most alluring temptation in the narrative is the one that must be resisted no matter what's the cost, which is temptation to power. So he sees this power is corrupting, like the kings fall, the kings get corrupted, and the Two Towers. You have the king who's been corrupted by the advisor who's spreading him lies, and he has this belief that everything is bad, that there is an inherent evil in the world that can't be defeated outside of a final battle. And even in writing about history, he wrote once in a letter that he does not expect history to be anything but a long defeat. Schuyler, do you want to talk a little bit about that long defeat?
Yeah, so I love this line. It's one of my favorite quotes of his from all time, because I really think that a lot of I speak for myself, but I think a lot of people these days really struggle with this idea and the idea of progress. Certainly, Tolkien comes out of a Christian background, and a lot of Christian theology is pretty clear on what progress is. And Tolkien shared it, and C.S. Lewis shared it, and a lot of these folks shared it, which is that evil is within the world, and evil is going to win in this world. That is a foregone conclusion. Things will fall apart. You will have victories, and goodness will have victories. But ultimately, we are all honor bound to fight for victories, but we are all ultimately powerless against them, and that the true victory will happen beyond this world in some form. That beginning starts with sort of the fall. In Christian theology, the Adam and Eve apple in the garden story. Not apple; it's just a fruit, actually. But it's this idea that original sin is within the world. Satan is there in its very bones, and that is very real. And so in the Lord of the Rings, you see this pattern again and again, how corruptible people are. There's he talks about, in going to mythology, he points at this idea, looking at like the Norse gods, for example. The Norse gods, if you look at their mythology, they're different than like the Greek gods, where the Norse gods are clearly supposed to be relatively good. Like they're on the right side. You're supposed to look at them and see them as sort of these people that are on your side are good, not always uncomplicated, but generally good. But here's a quote that they're on the right side, but it is not the side that wins. The Norse gods are destroyed. They're killed in some ways to make way for all of us. The winning side is chaos and unreason. But the gods who are defeated think that defeat is not a refutation. And I think that psychology is very different than a lot of how we carry today, which is we assume that that progress needs to win in order for it to be right. And that's part of the despair we feel when it doesn't, when elections go the wrong way or people are doing horrible things, that somehow there's shame in defeat. But Christianity says that, look, there's nothing that's always going to happen, right? There's nothing that we can do about that. Evil is an ever-present force. That sin is everywhere. It's part of the daily experience that we have, and it's not resonant in one person. It's just around. It's part of human nature. And we see that in the corruptibility of all the characters in Lord of the Rings, even the good ones. Frodo did not succeed in his task. At the end of the Lord of the Rings, he got there just like Isildur before him, centuries before, got to Mount Doom and had the ring and said, "I'm not going to throw it in." Right? He was corrupted, even someone so pure as Frodo. And the hobbits, who were Tolkien's emblematic, pure, simple person, right? He based them off kind of like the simple soldier that he experienced in the trenches in World War I. The basic goodness of the English people were the hobbits. That was an allegory that he actually spoke to very directly. But you see that with Frodo. You see Gandalf refusing to even touch the ring because of fear of being corrupted by it. You see Boromir, who was noble and also saw that the ring could be used and was corrupted by it. And so this idea that even the very best of us ultimately can fall to corruption, and really inevitably will fall to corruption, but that there is still some great nobility that is possible in every single person, and that our work is to be on the side of that nobility as best as we can, and that the goodness chooses us as their allies, and that there's heroicism to be found in resistance to that evil, and that corruption, and that in those temptations that it offers us. And we see that with power today, right? Like Tolkien talks about the idea that power is such a temptation, and so clearly we see that in our world these days with the people who sell their souls to be powerful, to get elected, to align with people who have that. And the ring represents that, right? And so people who refuse to take it on or see it as something that is inherently dangerous are in some ways very courageous and wise. And then we see people like Boromir who believe they can use that power for good, and how ultimately that fails them. You can't play with the power of evil, or the temptations that corrupt, and expect not to get consumed by them because of the human nature that Tolkien believes from his Catholic background.
But I really have to wonder how much of that is also shaped by I'm thinking about his experience in World War One. He in general has also very much a bone to pick with like the industrialization kind of progress, like that Saruman is this figure who cuts down all the trees and gets rid of nature to make way for doing things a mechanical way, and between that kind of progress and corrupted power, he had seen that so vividly in World War One, like a war that was basically more in essence than anything fought over colonialism, wanting to who can control Europe and who can control the world, and he had seen how all of this can lead to such horrible bloodshed, and like to face everybody was told before World War One that we're on such this positive trajectory towards towards history. I suppose we got a little bit of that in the 90s with the end of history talk, so we can kind of understand that as well. But it was very much this idea that we're headed towards, like, we're so close to just achieving the best world. And then World War One happened, and it really just threw so much disillusionment into so many people, that they thought that all these machines that were so great for helping improve the world, suddenly these machines are mowing them down in trenches and dropping biological warfare on folks like this. It was just I have to imagine it was a horrible experience that really shaped that idea of good and evil and of power and of progress. I want to head back to something though that you were talking about, because it really intrigued me as you were talking about how they see these figures and these seem so ancient and old, and so you do have that the human characters and the hobbits who are at least semi-human, that they are all much younger. You do have that Aragorn is significantly older because he's of an older race of humans called the Numenoreans. That's a whole side conversation we can have in a little bit. But then you do also have that, like, the elves that they come in contact with, such as Elrond, has literally been alive for thousands of years, who has seen more than one rise and fall of Sauron. That he has this ancient memory that in his parental elves and humans and such where some of those elves even experience these major angels. So you have like this whole hierarchy. Both you have a god figure, but then you have these major angels, then the minor angels and spirits, one of which ends up becoming Gandalf, as you mentioned. But then you do have these elves who have like this longer memory, but their culture is just so much different than like the hobbits, who are just sitting around smoking and drinking and having fun and enjoying life. And so it's curious to think about how these different worlds were interacting between these very different races. And like I always found that intriguing, thinking we all have this very clear idea of what it means to be human. I don't know if I call that a clear idea. I guess we all have experience of being human. There's my better statement. We all have experience of being human, but he lays out these varying races that are human-esque. They're not like too different from us that they're unfamiliar. But you have these almost somewhat humanly angel figures. You have somewhat humanly spirit figures that even sometimes take the form of humans, such as Gandalf. But then you also then have the elves who live for thousands of years and who sail away, and you have the dwarves who are dwelling under in the rock and mining, and then you have the humans and the hobbits. You have so many different races experiencing so many different things, and in the series, and in the wider lore, it's part of this whole narrative that the god has created all of this in a song of creation, and everything has actually happened, uh, but that it is being played out. The song that was sung before creation is now being played out, and as a teenager and early 20 something, when I was reading this the first few times, I always just found that to be this beautiful imagery, that that the song that was played of creation, and then how it is played out. So I mean, I find his creation mythology and the idea of like different races that are human-esque, but like are different enough from us that we're like, well, that's kind of weird to live for a couple thousand years. So, what kind of theological insights do you think of thinking about these different races that he's laid out in this mythology?
I think I think Tolkien would have believed that they represent, in some ways, different aspects of the human experience. That they were different ways that we engage with each other in the world. I think he was, in some ways, most fascinated by the elves and enjoyed writing about the elves the most. And you see that in his many works of them, whether it's the Fall of Gondolin, to Luthien and Baron, the epic poem. That there's a really desire to live in that world, and in some ways the human beings, I mean the men as he calls them, appeared really late, and in some ways their story is always kind of the second act to the elves. Although that changes as they kind of appear and grow and become eventually sort of a threat in some degree to the elves. And we're asked to, I think, sympathize with the elves, but also see ourselves in human beings, and also into the hobbits specifically. It's not. I think it's interesting how Tolkien plays off the humans and the hobbits in the Lord of the Rings, because in some ways they're both of us. That the humans are obviously people just like us, but also there's a grandness to them that a lot of us don't necessarily live up to. Like you were saying, the Númenóreans were a special kind of people. They were mixed with elves, many, many, many years ago, thousands of years ago, and they actually had their own kingdom. But this is more Lord of the Rings theology, or I guess history or lore. But the big difference, of course, between the elves and humans is that elves live forever, and human beings do not. They die, like human beings do. And when these human beings, the Númenóreans, started to figure that out, they got mad about it, and they're like, "This is kind of a bad deal for us." And they heard about this land where the elves all went and could live forever, and they were basically like, "Well, let's go do that, and we should go." And what they also knew that they were forbidden from doing that. That the angels and God had basically said they weren't allowed to do that, and so they summoned the largest army, the largest navy that the world had ever seen, and they were really strong, even though they were short-lived humans. They were very dangerous, and in the way to get to the Undying Lands where the elves were, they were destroyed by the angels in punishment, and they had their islands sunk, and those who survived, who were considered the faithful ones, were allowed to go and land in Middle Earth. And they were the ones who founded the kingdom of Gondor and Arnor to the north, and which Aragorn is the descendant of. And so even there you have the fall from grace, the temptation and the failure of humankind. And these are the best people who are Middle Earth still, right? Like Aragorn is considered the model of virtue, and it was his people that had fallen so far. There are other human beings that are not in the West, as it's called, that are not so good. They've been corrupted. There's also some problematic views of them as sort of foreign to England, right? They look kind of Middle Eastern and presented in that way, which is an unfortunate product of Tolkien's time and education in place. But there's definitely those racial undertones that, like, the men of the West are blonde-haired and very white and blue-eyed and such things. But even them are very fallible. And then the Shire folks, though, are very humble, right? Like the English peasant folks, the regulars who fought and got drafted in wars, the simple folks who represented their own kind of allegorical purity.
Well, I think, as you're talking about the remnant, I couldn't help but flash back to growing up as a teenager with the Left Behind series. And while that's not a Catholic worldview necessarily, this idea of like the faithful remnant that always perseveres, that, most people will fail, but there'll be the faithful remnant of the church is a very, very Catholic idea and very, very Christian theological concept. Like that there's always like some group that gets it right because it can't go completely wrong. Like there's going to be some group that somehow stays faithful in the midst of all this. And I mean, the other interesting thing about Numenor is that the reason that all of this happens, that they were fairly content there, but then they come and are tempted by this bright, shining figure who appears to be this great person, and it's Sauron, who has disguised himself to look like this wise creature after having served for the devil figure Melkor of the universe, and so he's Sauron, who's our main bad guy in the whole series, is like the second in command for the devil, basically, in terms of comparable to Christian mythology. But he comes and does this work, and it's him that leads them astray. That says like, "Oh, hey guys, like they're doing this over here. Like, don't you want that? Like, why not? Why not you too?" So very much like the tempter sort of figure from like Christian theology as well. I mean, and I think I cannot say that I'm versed with the end of the world lore in Lord of the Rings, but like overall, there is like this idea that the elves and the gods, like the angel gods, not like the highest god, that they don't even know what's like. They know the humans die, and they're just curious, like what actually happens to them. They like think they go to be with the god figure, but they don't know what's going to happen. They're curious. So you have these two different narratives that like the elves travel to the west and they get to live forever with the angel people, but then the humans are going to die and no one knows what exactly is going to happen, and they're all very curious. Like it's a really interesting, like for someone who is Catholic and very orthodoxly Catholic, this is a very different way to conceive of the afterlife. It was not quite the same. And I think it relates to his passion for like thinking of a bigger picture, that it's not just like one race doing things. Well, and you mentioned the people of the East, and they're seen as being like the Melkor and Sauron worshippers. They're the ones who've always been corrupted, unlike the somewhat pure remnant of the Westerners, who are exemplified by the noble British hobbits smoking and drinking and not colonizing the entire earth at all. They, they have that, but then you also have the orcs, which in the wider mythology are corrupted elves. And so you have this idea that like humanity, that elves, that there is this natural corruption. Do you want to talk a little bit about like about that sort of like the orcs as the corruption, and what if the orcs had one, I suppose, would be another question. Like what is the world if the orcs are in charge?
There's some really interesting writing about the morality of orcs, and what it is to be an orc and what orcs think and feel. Because so often they're basically portrayed as sort of these like mindless embodiments of evil and just terribleness. and what Ember said about they're basically elves that were captured. Not each one of them, but the elves were captured at some point by either Melkor or Sauron, and they were twisted and tortured uh, and turned into these through various experiments into these sort of beings that were orcs, and then they replicated them, and it's sort of this sad, scary thing. But people have looked at orcs and seen and tried to find like, well, what is it like? What do orcs? What are their organizing principles? What do they believe in? And there's some interesting lines that people like look for in the Lord of the Rings, where like orcs are talking amongst themselves very briefly about like, well, this would be bad if this happened, or like this person doesn't know what they're doing. And you can see little glimpses of, if not morality, at least some cognitive awareness of things could be better or worse. That there are, there's I think one conversation where like orcs are like, I don't really want to be involved in this fight. Like it doesn't really, can't we just like go away and like leave this, not have to deal with all of this like battle between, with Sauron and versus the West, a sense of like, this isn't really my fight. I don't want to be part of it. Very small glimpses that like maybe orcs aren't entirely corrupted themselves, that there is some, as much as you could say humanity there for them, which I think is really interesting. There's also a sense within Tolkien, and he talks about this separately from the books as well, that evil itself cannot create new things on its own, that it's not capable of creative, generative work, and that it can only imitate or mock and twist. And so it's very intentional in this theology that like Satan, even in Christianity, doesn't have the ability to create human beings. He doesn't have the ability to make his own world, because Satan isn't as strong as God themselves. All Satan can do is take what has been created and turn it bad. And that's true also with the Lord of the Rings world, where evil is always there and it's incredibly powerful, but it's a way of not giving it that creative power that is reserved only for God. And that's a theology that we see popping up in Christianity all over the place, right? Like in sort of destructive ways, toxic ways, where the church sees itself as the protector of women's bodies around creative, giving birth, right? Like only God has the ability to decide these things, and so we don't allow women to choose, we don't allow contraception, we don't, that's the purview of God alone, and anything to mess with that is to try to play this God, or take what God alone reserves as the power to do. So Tolkien plays around with that a little bit when he talks about, orcs were not created, they were ultimately still of the main God, and that is important, and that the world is still controlled in some form by the divinities at play.
So I suppose kind of as a last question for our portion. So if you have questions, get them ready, post them in that chat. We'll be getting ready to field them here in just a second. One of the central themes, we talked about this fight against evil, that even if it feels like a losing fight, that we're still on the side of the good. This is a myth very much about heroes. They may be very easily corruptible heroes, they may not be perfect heroes, they may have very huge flaws, but this is a story about heroism and how we stand up in the face of all the worst odds. Like, it seems very likely that Sauron is going to win this all. Like, what are the chances that one hobbit and his friend can make it all the way in, and later have the eagles rescue them, that they can make it all the way in and defeat this? Like, it seems like such insurmountable odds that they're up against, there's very much a theology of heroism, that they're called to stand in courage against anything that may come. Like, it doesn't matter, as long as you're on that side of good, you need to be heroic and stand for that. Do you have any thoughts about like his theology of heroism before we start moving to fielding some questions?
Yeah, I think some of the best quotes from Lord of the Rings, which some of us know, are about that. I'll share some of those just because I think that I don't know, they're just great. There's this classic line that when Frodo's talking to Gandalf, where Frodo says, "I wish," he's talking about this war and all the trouble that is facing the world now. And he says, "I wish it need not have happened in my time." And Gandalf replies, "So do I, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to do is decide what to do with the time that is given us." Which I think is really true, right? That our job isn't to necessarily win. It's not necessarily to have all the solutions, but it is to do what we can with what the time we have. There's a I don't think this is part of that same conversation, but there's another great line that speaks to that, which is, I think this is Gandalf speaking again. He says, "It is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so those who live after us may have clean earth to till. What weather they shall have is not ours to rule." And so there is an understanding here about what our role is in our life, in our time, in our place, that we are to do what is asked of us for good, with the power that we have in the place and the people we are with. But we should be under no illusion that we will be the ultimate deciders of that, right? We don't master the tides of the world. What weather the future shall face is not ours to control or rule. All we can do is what the time that we have in front of us, what we can do, and that's I think there's something deeply reassuring about that, and it limits us from spiraling into illusions of control and despair when we realize that we don't ultimately have control, which I think can happen to us. And so heroism then is to embrace that, is to know that that is the work. It's not always glamorous work, because if we equate glamour with victory, we're going to be in trouble. Theoden, before one of the big battles with the Rowan, here's another quote that I like. He's right. He says, "A time may come soon when none will return. Then there will be a need for valor without renown, for none shall remember the deeds that are done in the last defense of your homes. Yet the deeds will not be less valiant because they are unpraised." And I think that's really important, right? Because we don't fight for glory, we don't fight for victory. We fight because we care about the world, and we see ourselves as on the side of the just and the true, and we don't do it because we believe that there is some ending that we are achieving. We do it because it's simply the right thing. And if we do the good because we expect some certain outcome, then we're really doing it in a transactional way, which is trying to barter with goodness or God or honor or whatever else it is. But we need to pursue it because it is just a virtuous thing. And so in creating a world where evil in some ways is bound to win in the end, Tolkien reminds us that the work, whether you're Aragorn, whether you're Gandalf, whether you're Frodo, your work is to do the task that's in front of you, do everything you can, do it with courage and honor, but recognize that you can't control the tides or the weather, and there is something liberating in that.
I think that those are some vital lessons for this moment in history. I know I definitely see that quote about, "I wish I did not have to live through this." I see that one tossed around a lot. So those are vital lessons for us to hear and think about in these challenging times that we face. I'm going to go ahead and end our recording. So any who are joining in the future on YouTube or Facebook video, it was wonderful to have you join.